Good day, everyone, and thank you for attending this parallel session on South African English and OUP Southern Africa. I want to say a really big thank you to the OED team for allowing the branches to showcase our efforts in this regard at the symposium. Today, I will mainly be focusing on our efforts in the last 15 years or so. But it would be a travesty if I didn't acknowledge right up front that really we are standing on the shoulders of giants with regards to the work done from around 1969 by the Dictionary Unit for South African English. At that time, it was the Branfords, Jean Branford and William Branford, who started this work. And Oxford University Press has been very, very proud to be partners as publishers with these initiatives from the start. As you can see, there was firstly the Dictionary of South African English published, and then a lot of work happened under successive editorial teams at the Dictionary Unit for South African English in Grahamstown at Rhodes University. And the result of that was a Dictionary of South African English on Historical Principles, which is still seen as the primary source for lexicographical research on South African English. I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but I did just want to show you a quick slide of the latest incarnation of that dictionary. Where it has moved to the web and in a design and functionality that I think rivals the best in the world. Tim van die Kerk from the Dictionary Unit will be speaking at one of the panels about their work in this regard. So I won't say any more, but just to say that for anyone interested in more detailed research, more academic research, about South African English, I would really recommend that you visit this website and play around a bit. There's some really fantastic functionality to explore there. But on then to the main topic of today, which is how OUP dictionaries, specifically OUP SA dictionaries, have interacted with South African English through the last 15 or so years. I think it's important to start with the why of it. Why do we seek to cover South African English? And there are really two broad answers to that. The first one being that OUP as a publisher in all its incarnations across the world has the central mission. And we see promoting diversity and inclusion in our content and really helping to make customers proud of their variety of English as really central to the mission of what we're trying to achieve across the world as OUP. But of course, especially a publisher like OUP South Africa also has a commercial imperative alongside the mission imperative. And so the need for localizing dictionaries initially was driven by that commercial imperative. And more recently, we've also seen an increased licensing demand for world Englishes, including South African English content. So the response really from OUP can be classified as first starting with localized dictionaries, mainly monolingual English dictionaries, but also bilingual dictionaries, published at OUP South Africa. But then moving on to targeted campaigns to increase coverage in the OED and our licensed data sets. And then also branch involvement to increase coverage in the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary's 10th edition. All of this happens alongside thought leadership and promotional activities such as Words of the Year, blogs, and conferences or symposia like this one. But very importantly for us in South Africa is that we also at the same time get targeted messaging across to our teachers that South African English is not slang or inferior, because that is a huge obstacle to the path of what we're trying to achieve. Teachers are really the gatekeepers when it comes to teaching English. And I think this is something that recurs across the world with World Englishes. So that has been a real focus area for us. So to shift then a little bit to the product side of things and what all this mission imperative and commercial imperative have resulted in. Well, firstly, the localized English print dictionaries that I refer to. And here there is a range from our flagship Oxford South African Concise dictionary down to a range of school dictionaries, of which the Oxford South African School Dictionary is our best-selling title, and really, for us, our key priority in driving localized dictionary making into our school system. But firstly, just to focus on the Oxford South African Concise Dictionary, which is our flagship. It was an initiative that was started really in partnership with the Dictionary Unit for South African English that I referred to earlier already. They are our authors on this dictionary. And it was comprehensively revised, again in partnership with them, in 2010. And I think it's safe to say that it is the standard desk dictionary used in South Africa by English-speaking adults and as classroom copies in higher school grades. It includes a range of loan words from other South African languages like Domba, Kalfoot, Makarapa, and others. Also words that only have meaning in South African cultural history, like fika, happy letter, red ant, tik, and vuvuzela, and then South African plants and animals such as kuta, Cape vulture, rhinoceros, tapelia, and tiger's jaw. I thought to just liven this up with a few examples, in case any of you were wondering what a Makarapa is. This is a term that really shot to prominence during the soccer, I suppose in England you'd call it football, World Cup in 2010, where these wonderfully adorned and brightly colored miners' helmets appeared alongside the drone of the vuvuzelas that you would hear at every match. So it was very important for us at that time to include the word Makarapa in our revision. And it comes from Sesotho sa Leboa, the men who work in the cities. But I think what I also just want to illustrate is that we're not just talking about adding new words, we're also talking about adding new senses of words. And the red ant example is a very good one of that, whereas you have the general sense as another term for a fire ant, but then in a South African context, it can also refer to a member of a private security firm appointed by a local authority to execute eviction orders. And these were much feared and by the local communities hated people. Moving on from the concise to one step down, our next foray into a bigger localized dictionary was the Oxford South African Pocket Dictionary. It's always a bit funny to refer to a dictionary that's over 1,000 pages as a pocket dictionary, but at OUP, as you'll realize, I hope, everything is measured against the OED. This pocket dictionary of ours was also comprehensively revised and updated in 2015 and still very much drew on that original research done by the Dictionary Unit for South African English. But we augmented that with the latest corpus resources and research we had available at the time, as this dictionary's development really coincided with a bit of a bloom period for us at OUPSA in the way that we could use corpora and align our use of corpora with what was happening at our main branch in Oxford. This dictionary is also used in South Africa by adults and in higher grade school classrooms, but you'll find a lot more of these dictionaries being used by the pupils themselves and not just as classroom copies. Again, this dictionary included loanwords from other languages such as Gies, Izinyoka, Loskop, Mahala, Murabaraba, and Zamazama. Words that have only meaning in South African culture or history, such as crown, birthday, etals, load shedding, which is very topical at the moment as we're going through periods of rolling blackouts again, that we refer to locally as load shedding due to insufficient electricity resources. But one thing that sets this dictionary aside from the Concise that preceded it, and that I want to just mention very clearly, is that part of the localization is not just looking for these loanwords from other languages or words that only have meaning in South Africa. It also to us means that we feed our local textbooks into a corpus and then do comparative corpus analysis to identify words that have a higher proportional frequency in the South African curricula than they might have in other curricula, for example, in the UK or the US. And as a result, include those, even though they may not strictly adhere to the frequency criteria that we would normally follow for inclusion in dictionaries. There are some examples there on screen. And just to then illustrate a few of the words that I've mentioned on the previous slide, crown birthday is a very interesting South African tradition. It's the day on which your age is the same as the date of your birthday, and it's celebrated quite widely here in the Western Cape, where I'm speaking to you from, in South Africa, around and about Cape Town especially. But then there are also the less pleasant things like the Izinyoka, the people who either steal physical cables or make illegal electrical connections. And that comes from the isiZulu word for snakes. Just quickly moving on from the Pocket Dictionary to the Oxford South African School Dictionary, which is the one that I mentioned is our best seller and the primary way in which we reach customers at school. Here you can see some examples from that, including the word Bucky. And it's an interesting point to me that this vehicle changes name across the world. In Australia, for example, they refer to as Utes, but in South Africa, they're very much known by the colloquial name Bucky. Another word that I just wanted to highlight because it very much illustrates what I was saying earlier about the importance of corpus analysis of curriculum-based material is the word orthophoto, which is a key component of the geography curriculum in South Africa, but not so much in other parts of the world. So this is a term we would not have included in our dictionaries before we managed to do the kinds of corpus analysis on corpora. On curricula that we've done subsequently. Then, moving on from the localized dictionaries, from the latter part of the 2010s, I think it became abundantly clear to us that the market for localized print dictionaries for adults would not be as strong, or not continue to be as strong as the market is for school dictionaries. So we really wanted to get to a point where we could collaborate with our UK branch to make sure that all that research that we had done and that was reflected in the localized print dictionaries for adults would not be lost entirely. And so, especially from around 2018, we've been working much more closely with the OED and the current dictionaries team to make sure that filters through into their data sets. And that included taking part in supporting appeals by the OED, for example, the youth language appeal in 2018, but then also much more directly supporting the UK teams by reviewing South African English batch updates for the OED or the current dictionaries licensing data sets. And as you'll see from the example I've put there, bunny chow, which is a very typically South African dish consisting of a hollowed out loaf of bread or part of a loaf and then filled with curry, That was one of the resulting terms from the 2018 update. Beyond the work with the OED and the current dictionaries team, we have also become much more involved as a branch in the work that the English language teaching branch in Oxford does across the world. And we were very honored and proud to have been involved in the latest edition of the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, which is really, I think, one of the best-selling dictionaries across the world. We were approached from around 2018 on to contribute World English content. And to that regard, there was a real collaboration between OUP South Africa and East Africa teams and ELT. And the contributions were then recognized, as you can see on the right-hand side. And we really feel that it's resulted in a much more inclusive new edition of this incredibly important dictionary in the language teaching environment. Some of the words, an example is an imbongi, which in traditional African society is a person who writes and performs poems praising an important figure. But then also a fun word like zol, which is a colloquial term for a cigarette, especially of cannabis, that is rolled by hand. And this has become quite a topical issue recently when one of our South African ministers used this word in their justification for a cigarette ban during the first lockdown of the COVID-19 first serious wave to use it, by saying that when people zol, they share cigarettes, and that could lead to increased risk of transmission of COVID-19. So very much part of our current collective South African culture, and it even spawned quite a few musical interpretations of that phrase, when people zol. I just want to take a step back and talk about these wonderful words that I've just mentioned, but how do we find them? I have alluded to the corpus work already, but just to go into a bit more detail about that. Well, really, I think in the 2010s, that was a big breakthrough for us here at OUP SA, was to move from anecdotal evidence or reading programs to really being able to look at corpus-based evidence. OUP's global monitor corpus, Komodo, a lexicographical in-joke of a sort, is regularly updated with internet content from across the globe. And that data is geographically tagged. So it is possible for us to create a South African subcorpus, and then again to create a subcorpora from that subcorpus based on specific years, because the data is also tagged by year. The keyword functionality that our corpus querying tool Sketch Engine then offers us allows us to check South African subcorpora against the global corpus and against each other on an annual basis. But also, we are able to use our textbook corpora, where we've put all our OUP SA textbooks into a corpus, and do a similar keyword analysis. And this all allows us to isolate new South African English lexical items, identify words of the year, and as I've said earlier, even allows us to make sure that we give full coverage to South African curricula in our South African school dictionaries. Just a quick slide on how that would work. As you can see at the top there, we would isolate the subcorpus, and then we would use the keyword functionality to compare that with a reference corpus, in this case, the whole corpus. And this corpus querying tool allows us a lot of flexibility in terms of setting the minimum frequency of words that we want to compare with each other, or even whether we want to compare rarer words or more common words or occurrences of words in our corpus research. And that flexibility allows us to play around with different things. We might use one set of settings when we want to do a comprehensive extraction of South African English, but we might use another set of settings when we want to look for words of the year or do trend analysis in a given month or a given year. Moving on then from finding those new South African English words to just looking beyond new words. As I've already mentioned, it extends to revising the entries, and it could be looking for new senses that come into being in South African English, or even new parts of speech, as we saw with Zol, which is usually used as a noun. It can then turn into a verb as well. But I think the key thing about all of that is we make sure before we make any revisions that we have solid corpus evidence backing us up. We not only look at the South African English content, but we also look at general English words that develop South African specific senses. And here the most frequently used example is the old one of a robot in South Africa, meaning a traffic light. So when we tell you to stop at the red robot, we're not talking about an invasion from nearly sentient beings. We are simply telling you to stop at the traffic lights. But there are also more recent developments in this regard that we keep track of. And the example that I mentioned earlier of the extra sense that Red Ant developed is a good example. Lastly, though, there are also the not so nice bits. And there it is very important that two of us from OUP South Africa serve on the global committee that looks after sensitive content and the revision of sensitive content in the global dictionary data sets. And we have to give a lot of care to this potentially sensitive content that may have different nuances or meaning in South Africa to what they might have in the rest of the world. And a good example of that is the word colored. And it is a term that even now we are going to have to revise again for dictionaries such as the OED, as its use as a self-designation is becoming more and more disputed than it was earlier. But this is an ongoing task, and it is something we take very, very seriously at OUP generally and at OUPSA to make sure that we are reflecting language as it is used, but in a sensitive and inclusive way. And that is really all I have to share with you today. Thank you very much again for attending. And if you do have any questions, please send them to the address there, oed.uk@oup.com. Thank you very much.